Hey everyone, my name is Gonella. I'm a freshman here, and today I want to talk to you about the future of cryptography, specifically a new method of encryption known as elliptic curve cryptography that's been taking the security world by storm and is showing to be one of the, if not the most secure methods yet to be discovered. So in order to understand why we need this, we need to start by talking about why we need encryption, and specifically, what do we use it for? So the short of it is people want your data. People want to know what you know. And one of the first and major uses of encryption is in order to control who knows about your data. Encryption allows you to segregate those who do know and those who don't know about the data that you control. Now, the second, and while less common, still very common use, is encryption allows you to prove who you are. Using encryption, we can say, I am for sure Nick Gonella. I'm not someone else. Now, encryption specifically is formatted into two types. Now, prior to 1976, all encryption was done symmetrically. What this meant is that the same key would encrypt and decrypt a message. Now, this led to something called the codebook problem. And this problem was, all right, if I want to communicate with Ryan here, then the first thing I need to do is give him the key. But how do I securely give him the key? Well, I'd need to encrypt that key. But in order to encrypt that key, I need another key for the encryption algorithm, on and on and on, to the point where you get these gigantic processions of generals carrying code books back in the ancient times between. And in addition to being very inefficient, it was dangerous because there could always be spies or who knows who else. So in 1976, RSA was invented, and with that was born asymmetric encryption. Now, this is the opposite of symmetric, and it's exactly as it sounds. There are different keys for encryption and decryption. So one key turns a message into encrypted data, and a different key turns this message turns it back into regular text. So here we see a picture of that. We see the sender can get a public key, which is the encryption key, and turn plain text into ciphertext. And then that ciphertext can be anywhere around, and no one can decrypt it except the original person who has the private key. So the way this works is a trapdoor. This is a trapdoor. Now, if you'll notice something interesting about this trapdoor, it's one directional. It is much harder to go up the trapdoor than down. And that's because of gravity, but this isn't the only thing that can be one directional. Mathematics can also be one directional, and these are called trapdoor functions. Now, what this means is, like a trapdoor, it's very easy to do this operation, but it's very difficult to undo the operation. Now, one example of that is factoring numbers. If I pick two random prime numbers and multiply them together, just multiplying them together, that's a pretty easy operation. But then if I wanted to take that new number and find the two original numbers, that would be incredibly difficult. You have to basically for the most part, brute force try all these different combinations of numbers until eventually you found it. And if these numbers got big, it could take longer than the time of the universe. And that is how RSA works. Now, RSA is the asymmetric encryption scheme I mentioned before. And in order to understand elliptic curve cryptography, you first need to understand how RSA works. So the idea is you take these two random prime numbers and you multiply them together. Then you select an integer e. Now what e is your public key. That's the number that you distribute to everyone, as I showed in this diagram. This would be e. So once you have e, you can use a certain algorithm to calculate calculate d, which is your private key. Now, when you want to encrypt something, the first thing you do is take your plain text message, the message you want to send, you encode it in some kind of number system. So you have to make it into numbers, and then you would take that number to the power of your public key, and then modulo n. Now what modulo means is basically remainder. If a lot of you remember 4th or 5th grade division, instead of making fractions, you do 3 remainder 2 for a number that didn't evenly divide. Modulo is basically doing this division and taking the remainder. Now, when I want to decrypt that message with the private key, I can do the same operation. I take the ciphertext, take it to the power of my private key and do modulo, and because of the way that the private key is generated, because of that special algorithm, it is guaranteed to go back to my original message. And so you can have this system where as long as you can actually go forward, you can apply 2 operations and they undo each other, but the middle operation doesn't tell you about either end. So that's the whole idea of asymmetric encryption, this idea of being able to put out one key that encrypts things and you can't tell about the other key that decrypts. Now, factoring numbers is a really good trapdoor. Multiplication is relatively easy for computers, and brute force factoring is very difficult. There are studies that show about massive amounts of time it takes to factor these numbers, and in addition, you can increase the size of the key that you're using. So a lot of people hear about RSA 1024, RSA 2048. These are the number of bits in the key, and these gigantic numbers can take forever for a computer to factor, theoretically. But this does have the downside of taking more processing power. The larger the RSA key, the more processing power something needs. So this is a good trapdoor. But is it good enough? In recent mathematics and recent discoveries, there have been certain algorithms that have found factoring numbers on a bitwise level, so looking at numbers as bits, actually is easier than just trying to factor numbers. And so you get one algorithm known as the quantum sieve. And what this algorithm basically does is exactly that. It looks at the numbers at the bitwise level and is actually able to derive certain properties and be able to factor easier. And the downside of these is those larger keys that I referenced, those are actually more efficient for the quantum sieve to go through. So the trapdoor becomes smaller. Now, on the other side, as we get bigger and bigger keys, multiplication becomes more difficult. And in an age where we all have mobile phones with much more limited processing power than your standard computer, thinking about how much power it takes to compute these keys becomes a non-trivial thing. And again, we see the trapdoor shrinking. It's becoming more difficult to multiply and less difficult to compute. And it goes against why we'd want it. But have no fear, ECC is here. Elliptic curve cryptography is a scheme similar to RSA in that it also leverages a trapdoor function. It uses this principle of something that's easy to do, but hard to undo. However, elliptic curve cryptography's trapdoor is much stronger. It's based on an esoteric branch of mathematics that really hasn't been studied until the late 80s, early 90s. So it's a new branch of mathematics, but it's been proven to be incredibly powerful and incredibly useful. Now this is an elliptic curve. This is what we need. It's described by that equation, and in that equation, we're assuming A and B are just constants. It's just a two-dimensional equation. A and B are some arbitrarily picked constants that change the width and vertical of this graph. Now you'll notice some interesting things about an elliptic curve. First off, that it's symmetric at the x-axis. So every point on top has a mirror point on bottom. Now, the thing that's very interesting about this is it can be mathematically proven that if you pick any 2 points on this curve and they are not the mirrors of each other, drawing a line through them will go to a third point on the curve. So, for example, if you could pick P and Q anywhere on the curve, and as long as they're not vertical, there will be an R on the elliptic curve. Now, this is very interesting, and it becomes our main machinery. I'm going to name this operation the dot operation. So, for example, we would say P dot Q is R, and the way we calculate a dot is by saying, take those 2 points, find the third point on the curve, and jump over. That is going to be our main machinery for elliptic curve cryptography. Now, keep in mind, this operation itself is not a trapdoor. It's very easy to undo, especially if you know 2 points. But you can expand this operation in a couple ways. First off, you can dot a point with itself, just by using the tangent line. So example, pretending that P and P are 2 points, you can do this one dot, so you find the tangent line, and that, as long as it's not at the back, it is also mathematically guaranteed to be a third point. Yeah, Max?
When you say flip, do you mean mirror over the x-axis?
Yes. When I say flip or take the reverse, I mean mirror it over the x-axis, as you can see by this diagram. So, the next thing we can do is dot a point with itself. So, if you see this GIF, we're constantly dotting the resulting. So we dot A with B, then we dot the resulting point with A, then the resulting point with A, then the resulting point with A. So what we can do is dot a point with itself an arbitrary number of times. Now, the question is, how many times did we dot it? That is our trapdoor. The analogy I've always heard for this is a pool player. If I were to go capture a pool player, throw him in a room for 10 minutes with a pool table and a cue ball and said, shoot around, then I could go in 10 minutes later and let him out. And even if I knew where he started and I saw where the ball ended up, I would have no idea how many times he shot the ball. The only way to figure that out would be if I tried every possible angle until I eventually found it. And if he shot around enough times, again, this could take more time than the universe has existed. And that's what we're trying to find. We're trying to find something that's easy to do, shooting the pool ball around, but difficult to undo, finding out how many times it was shot. And we can see where our key generation comes. So an important part of any elliptic curve scheme is the standard. Everyone needs to agree on the same curve equation, so that same A and B, so we're all using the same curve, and they all need to agree on the same starting point. Now, this doesn't lower the security of the curve at all, but it is required in order for everyone to be able to communicate. So next, you generate your private key. This would be a random number, better to be a prime, but it could be any random number, n, for example. Then your public key would be a point, and that point would be derived by dotting this start point A with itself n number of times. So it's like, again, doing this operation where you dot whatever is the result with itself multiple times. And eventually you'll come out with some arbitrary public key point. Now, if you'll notice, the trapdoor is going to be protecting our public key, or our private key rather. We'll be able to put our public key out there without people knowing how many times we did the operation from the starting point to the public key. And then we can use these keys for anything that we use RSA for, because all we have to do is take the point value. So for example, we could just say the x value is going to be the number that we use in place of RSA. Now, one example of this is what I call Diffie-Hellman 2.0. Diffie-Hellman is what's known as a key exchange software. It's a method, or it's not a software, a method. It's a method designed to avoid the codebook problem I mentioned. How do you communicate a symmetric key between two people without, at some point, sending it in plain text? Well, the way you do it is this. Alice and Bob are trying to communicate. Now, they both are going to generate a private key. They're both going to pick some random large number, and then they're going to both get the same standard point P and generate a public key. So they're both going to generate a public key with their private key by dotting it their private key number of times. Next, they can exchange these two public keys. Now, these public keys would be protected by the trapdoor. There wouldn't be any information leaks. But what they can then do is each apply their own public key to it. So for example, if Alice chose a private key of 5 and Bob chose a private key of 4, Alice dots P with itself 5 times, Bob dots P with itself 4 times. However, if Alice then dots Bob's public key by her 5 times, then that would be this. Basically, it's the idea of you can dot something 5 times and then 4 times, and you'll get the same thing as if you dot something 4 times and then 5 times. And so you allow this transfer of information. You can guarantee that they'll have the same information at the end without leaking the original time that they chose. That's what this Diffie-Hellman scheme allows you to do. So some common implementations of this, actually we see them a lot today. If any of you have IMAX, or if any of you use iMessage, that's entirely using elliptic curve cryptography. In fact, one of the reasons that you can't get iMessage on anything except a Mac is because Apple won't distribute their curve. They won't show people their standard or their initial point because they're a closed ecosystem or something. It's Apple. So in addition, Tor, the onion router, which is an anonymous browser, uses it to generate random numbers. Another use of elliptic curves can be generating random numbers. And it does this by, again, dotting it a certain number of, doing a dot a certain number of times, and that comes out deterministically, or pseudo-non-deterministically, to something that's called a cryptographically secure random number generator. We talked about this a while back, but basically it means that you can't predict them. So Tor uses this in order to create random numbers. Now, in addition, the US government uses elliptic curve cryptography as the standard for all internal communications. All of their stuff is encrypted with elliptic curves. And the last example that I'll talk a little bit about later, but I just want to reference it now, is what's called the dual elliptic curve deterministic random bit generator. This is a random number generator that actually took a lot of flack and is a major reason why we don't use elliptic curve cryptography nowadays. But I'll talk about that in a sec. Because first, you need to understand that there are some downsides. As much as elliptic curve cryptography is basically the best method of cryptography ever, there are some downsides. The first problem is because the public key is just some random number, you need a lot of entropy to make sure that you can't guess it. If you can guess the private key, then the whole system falls apart. So you need to make sure that whatever computer or machine that you're using to create your private key has a lot of entropy. Now, the other problem is malformed standards. So a problem with these curves is that they can be made badly. Certain curves can be made specifically so that they can have backdoors, or there are shortcuts to do them just by mathematical properties. And it's very difficult to tell if a curve is badly made unless you have several PhDs in a lot of things. And so that was the problem with the NIST incident. So one of the first major standards for elliptic curves was for the dual elliptic curve random bit generator. And this was a supposedly cryptographically secure random number generator. It was supposed to be, you cannot tell, you can't predict it, it's completely secure. And it was backed by NIST, the National Institute for Technology, in addition to a lot of other groups, including ISO and our good friends, the NSA. Now, after researching it, and a bunch of people who did have a bunch of PhDs looked at it and said, this curve is poorly created. This curve could theoretically have a backdoor. And a lot of people jumped to the conclusion that the NSA is commissioning people to make these bad standards. And if we use elliptic curve cryptography, we'll never know if our stuff is actually secure. And there was a large fear train and a lot of overgeneralizations. But while there was some evidence, they never actually proved that the NSA is specifically creating backdoors. However, it has led to a lot of fear, and that's why it has not been adopted as readily as it should be. Because, frankly, the benefits are staggering. It is more secure than RSA, more secure than the standard, even more secure than the standard asymmetric algorithm. There's no shortcuts that you can take. And even to look for a shortcut requires several more layers of abstraction than to work with RSA. You can't do the same thing by looking at just the bit level and trying to sift through it. In addition, studies have shown that a 228-bit elliptic curve key is equal to a 2,380-bit RSA key in the amount of time that it would take in order to crack. And both of these took, again, longer than the universe has existed. Now, so these keys are more secure, they're faster to compute because it takes less time to compute 228 bits than 2,380, and they're even faster to use. In a study, a 256-bit elliptic curve key could make 10 times as many Diffie-Hellman operations. So it could go through this Diffie-Hellman process 10 times faster than a similar RSA key. So with this presentation, I hope you've learned a little bit about this technology and about how incredible it is. And I'd like to leave you with my personal favorite way to authenticate. Thank you very much. Any questions? Brian?
Everything I thought that RSA was more of elliptic curve cryptography, or at least it utilized elliptic curves.
So the RSA company has been some of the RSA company has been using elliptic curves now, but the RSA method, the idea of doing RSA itself is a method of using the prime number factorization in order to generate public and private keys. But the company RSA does sometimes use elliptic curves.
I have like 2 slides, because I had a question on the ground once. Too many slides. I'll have to look at your policy later. I'll have to look at your policy.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Brian?
I guess it's not RSA, but I know that there's some standard of elliptic curve cryptography. The constants and the elliptic curve with a constant. Do you know why that is, especially for public forms cryptography?
Why A and B are constant?
Yeah.
So
why is it that they tend to be constant instead of changing? That is assumed as you add variables that increase.
Do you want to answer this?
Yeah, so it's really common that A or elliptic curve have certain properties that like you guarantee that with A and B, otherwise you get things like this standard. But like the only source of secrecy in this, the only part of the trapdoor function is how many times you're bouncing around that curve. And so like parameterizing the curve wouldn't help with the security model at all. It would just make it a lot harder to communicate with other people because you have to agree on the curve at random or in some ad hoc manner, which would typically choose bad curves that would be easily exploited.
One more question.
Awesome.
You said earlier that the disadvantage was that you need a lot of entropy to compute how the key is unguessable. How is that different from other forms of it? You always want an unguessable private key. What makes this a particular disadvantage of elliptic curve cryptography as opposed to any other kind of key-based?
So, all right. I just want to have my notes so I don't say something wrong. So with this, your private key is generated through 3 different random selections. You have to select P, you have to select Q, and you have to select E. These are all randoms. Versus your public, versus in elliptic curve cryptography, you're just picking a number. So from my research, it looked like it was more likely there was more of a chance to have that number just be guessed because there weren't these multiple levels of randomness. Yeah, the key derivation, because in RSA, the private key is derived from the public key, but in elliptic curve cryptography, the public key is derived from the private key. Ryan?
With prime K and Q, you were saying how the end result or end of these primes is, what was it?
N is the modulus. So N,
How many of these is that?
it can be as large as 400. I think 4,096 is the current highest. Yeah, it can be as big as you want, honestly, as big as your computer can
The
handle.
size of it or its security.
Yeah. So if you're getting a prime number that is that large, how do you assure that P and Q are both prime?
You can generate P and Q. I guess that's. I don't know.
There are clever algorithms to find numbers that are probably prime.
Probably tests. Because the only way to be deterministic is to essentially derive everything that's smaller than the square root of P.
Yeah.
So but there's very good algorithms that give you very high assurance.
There you go.
Looking at a fast enough implementation of factorial, you can actually do. You can actually find one where the only number where the test actually succeeds, but it shouldn't, is 4.
Interesting.
It's just because it's such a small number that it causes issues.
I was unaware of that. That's pretty cool. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening to me. Have a good time.